So here's an early theoretical piece I have for the new Frozen Legion skill. I think it looks really clunky on the surface, but the idea that I have in mind is to press it one time and do somewhere in the range of like 30, 40, 50 million DPS. I think it's great in that it's a skill that doesn't demand full uptime, but still could have enough clear speed if you scale it into AoE, and actually has some pretty insane numbers if you look at the PoB. So this 33.5 million DPS is off a single hit for all the things charged. I've run this 500% more damage in the config, and I'm using sweep as a baseline skill. I think that the numbers will be the same as sweep, except you're going to have all the clones, and then you have 6 clones total. So you have 1 sweep plus 500% more. This is what this is doing. When I'm doing my element calculations, I've just been taking this out and then looking at what this does against Uber bosses. It should check out. The rest is just check for defense stuff. And the 100% convert is built into Frozen Sweep, whereas regular Sweep doesn't have that. The core idea is to get a really slow hit. You can see my attack rate is 0.42, but this doesn't matter because Frozen Legion is a spell. You basically cast the spell, and that scales up your cast speed, and then your clones will attack based on your attack speed, but that's basically independent of what you're doing. Now, the only thing attack speed in my mind I think would give is slightly more responsiveness to that skill, but it doesn't really change your DPS or anything. The core uniques for this include Murrohy Urki, Heat Shiver, Expedition's End, and I mean, belts can really be anything, but I think Magnate's actually fairly strong. Murrohy Urki is great because it has really low attack speed, but really high base fizz. It's talking about something like, 1,000 physical damage on a single hit. Now, a really high skilled rare staff might be really good, or a really high skilled rare mace. Something with, high fizz, crit chance, crit multi would be fantastic. But I'm going to stick with this. In the past, it has been relatively accessible, especially in trade leagues. I don't really know because the buff to this was actually not that big. I would love to have a legacy not that good Muro hierarchy, and I think it'd just be fine. When you have a full convert to cold skill, Heat Shiver tends to be really powerful, and because we're using such gigantic single hits, we're actually able to hit freeze threshold, especially on non-Uber bosses. On Uber bosses, I will need to use Expedition's End and or Southbound as well later on, these things, because that will let your fire damage also affect the freeze threshold. This is a really rare chest too, but it's not that popular and it's not that commonly used. My boots aren't that important, but I am using a brittle ground implicit just to help you get to crit cap. The thing with how this skill works is that you are in the middle, and your clones will then target around you. And because this is the case, you pretty much always want to be directly on top of the boss you're trying to kill. You want to drop the ground, and then you press a skill, and then they all hit things, and it does 30 million damage in one hit. You will need a lot of accuracy if you want to use this, because it has minus 500 by default, and then I'm using accuracy here. I'm using shock focus as well. Really powerful because I am scaling ailment effect to some degree, and this focus shock is just great for timing with that burst window of pressing your Frozen Legion. And I just duplicated the string because I was lazy. Then talk about the belts, and then some multi-duels. So the multi-duels for Frozen Legion should actually be fairly easy to do. I think you can also use Elemental Multi and Cold Skill Multi, which are much easier mods to hit than just Melee and Global Crit Multi. But just the idea of what kind of duel you'd want to go for. You don't care at all about attack speed. Cast speed can be helpful, which is why when you look at this config, don't worry about the DPS, worry about the average damage. That's the core idea from gear. From the tree, I'm actually an Inquisitor. Inquisitor plays really well with Heat Shiver. I've actually played Heat Shiver Glacial Hammer in SF Hardcore. I took that character to like 92, 93. But it didn't really have the playability because you have to stand there and spam Glacial Hammer, which is a strike skill. This, I think, would actually be a little bit better, but you have to play things out. I would consider also using a 6-link Warchief setup. You do have a 1-point Ancestral Bond right here, which could help out quite a bit. I also don't really believe in the uptime of totems. The tree is pretty straightforward. I am going for quite a bit of strength because of Magnate. If you don't go for Magnate, you might just pass through the elemental damage nodes on the tree. I really value AoE. It's interesting to think about what the radius of Frozen Legion might be, because if the radius is the same as Sweep, 42 radius from 6 clones would actually be pretty nice for your clear. You might only have 1 or 2 of them up at a time, but it could be pretty good. If you want to have better clear, you could also go for cooldown recovery on boots and a belt, and it would help you do this thing much more often, but not a big deal. I'm pathing through here. There's actually a decent amount of resist and other utility on this tree. Some all res from here, some all res from here. I go for a little bit of crit. Divine Judgments here. I take effect non-damaging elements to scale the chill a little bit more, although you will be hitting max chill, but this is mostly for the shock. You can also go for all res here. All the mace nodes for this build are pretty much fantastic. Pain Forger is great. It can definitely get you the power charge generation you need. If you need power charge generation elsewhere, you could just run something like Galvanic Field with power charge on crit, if you really wanted to, and that would actually help you get that. Moving down here, I get some of the crit nodes, but I'm also taking the mace nodes. These are actually pretty low in terms of the damage it gives you, but because it gives you area of effect, I really prioritize this. This double damage, I don't know if this mastery will work. I imagine it might, because your attacks are really slow, but just in case it doesn't, something to think about. Looking for slow hitting things in general might be something to think about. Taking life over here, pathing down here through Call to Arms. I think personally I'll use Infernal Cry. Again, another supplement to your clear, but this could also be something like Enduring Cry if you want to have endurance charges and not be super glass. It could also be Intimidating Cry if you don't have an Awaken melee physical damage for that Intimidate, or you just want more consistency there. I don't think Seismic Cry will work because I don't believe you can actually exert this attack because it's your clones doing it. Soul Steel is being taken, one more Aura Cluster. I'm taking Precision Mastery here so I can fit in all my auras and still have a little bit of leftover mana. I don't personally want to go reduce cost if possible, but you could go for that on your jewelry. It's a really slow hitting build, hopefully you don't need to do that. Unwavering Stance grants you Stun immunity, and then I'm taking some max res and rounding out the tree over here. Another thing to take into account as you're rounding out this tree is, going for something like more cast speed, more life in general, perhaps some of the nodes for armor, which actually can help scale quite a bit, and maybe even these Warcry cooldown recovery nodes, and maybe the minimum power node, just to help your Infernal Cry clear a little bit better. The Gemstone straightforward, I'm running the main sweep skill. I'm running Hatred and Determine as our prime auras. You can also put in Determination here, maybe a Herald of Purity, maybe a Herald of Ash if you really want to. Asmark is the curse of choice. Because you're in a quiz, the elemental curses don't matter quite as much, although Punishment could be strong in a dual curse setup if, say, you got a +1 curse amulet or something. Or maybe Anointed Whispers of Doom. I personally wouldn't. War Chief is just helping out your damage. Again, you might want to add more links to this. Precision is the other aura that I'm thinking about doing. Really accuracy lacking when you're running Marohi. It is clearly a weapon that was designed to be taken with Resolute Technique, but I don't think that's necessary in this case. And then finally, I'm using a Vortex Bone Chill setup. You'll be on top of the boss, this will be great. And then Infernal Cry. You can also use an Unbound Ailments, you have the socket space. And finally, a CWDT Molten Shell. Don't use Leap Style on this build, it's going to feel absolutely horrible. Use your cast-based movement skill of choice, whether that's Frostblink, whether that's Flame Dash. I don't really think there's other options for this build. So yeah, all in all, I think it's a pretty interesting idea. Let me know if you have any other ideas along this line especially, or with the other skills. I personally think Frozen Legion has a lot of potential, especially in softcore, to do some really cool stuff. Ultimately, it's a base skill that, when all its cooldown is up, has something like 1700 damage effectiveness, and if you scale fully into that and you get to ignore the attack speed component while only scaling the attack damage component, it makes for a skill with some really interesting baseline interactions that you could really, really abuse. But again, it's all just theory.